Okay, I think we can start now. Thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Mbongiseni Buthelezi. I join you from Johannesburg. I have the pleasure of chairing this session. So what we're going to do in this session is really begin to take to delve a little deeper into what the chair this morning described as what we're trying to do on this first day of the conference, which is really, as also articulated in the program, describing the problem. So we have three speakers who are going to help us do this work of delving a bit deeper and understanding what are the problems we are talking about in South Africa today when it comes to this question of customary land. What are the issues people are facing? And in this particular discussion, we are looking at the dispossession that happens around graves in particular. One of the things that have happened historically, of course, is that we know that as Sonwabile Mnwana spoke about in the previous panel, and other speakers have done so, people have lost land historically, but also people continue to lose land in the present due to mining, especially. But also one of the speakers on the floor also brought into the conversation that there are other methods through which people are being dispossessed. And when people lose land, they lose, they lose the asset that they use for agricultural production, etc. But they lose it much more than just the land. There are spiritual elements to the land. There are other symbolic elements. People perform rituals on the land. People have their loved ones buried on the land. So what we're trying to understand more deeply in this panel is when people lose land, what are they losing? And we have three speakers who I will introduce in turn. The three speakers, just to name them, are Dineo Skosana, Simon Gush is the other speaker, and then our third speaker is Mbuso. I beg your pardon, I've just lost my notes here. So our three speakers, Dineo, Simon, and Mbuso Nkosi, most called the Mbuso Koza after the musician. So I think let's kick off with Dineo Skosana. Dineo is a researcher, a senior researcher at the Society Work and SWAP, at Society Work. I forget, you remind us, Dineo, what the rest of that acronym stands for at the University of the Witwatersrand. So with that, you have 15 minutes. Over to you, Dineo.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you, Mbongiseni, for that introduction. As Mbongiseni has already mentioned, my name is Dineo Skosana. I'm a researcher at SWAP, which is for Society Work and the Politics Institute. And before I kickstart my presentation, I just thought perhaps I should just give you a little bit of a background into this project that I'm working on. At SWAP, we've got a coal project which looks at South Africa's transition from coal mining and coal burning to renewable energy. And within this project, for instance, we trace, the labor-related issues in relation to the transition to renewable energy. And my specific area of work looks at mining-induced dispossession. And so my work is actually critical in framing or giving some of the reasons why the shift from coal mining and coal burning is necessary. And so without wasting any time, the title of my presentation is No Last Place to Rest. And the title really comes about as I was talking to one of the community activists in Somkele, and she said, "Githina ayisekho lento yokuthi umuntu uyobekwa endaweni yakhe eyokugcina," meaning we do not have this concept that a person is being laid at their last place to rest. And so this title actually informs the manuscript draft that I'm working on in the project, and so that's what I'll speak to. And also just to say that in the project, I look at two key areas, which is white agricultural farmland in the Mpumalanga province, where dispossession takes place through the private farm owners. as well as dispossession on tribal land, where dispossession takes place through chiefs or traditional leaders as you know them. And so today my presentation will speak specifically to KZN. And so without wasting any more time, let me start. So as many of you would know, and I think some of you perhaps would have seen my presentations before, coal mining takes place in different provinces in South Africa. And so that little box, which is in gray, that's where coal is mined. And so this is the northern parts of South Africa. So in the Limpopo province, particularly in the Waterberg area. It's also mined in the Mpumalanga province, and that's where mining companies as well as power stations are concentrated. And it's also mined in parts of KwaZulu-Natal, and that's what I'm going to cover today. And so my case study specifically looks at Somkhele, which is in the northern part of Richards Bay, next to St. Lucia, for those who are familiar with KZN. And so my argument today is that dispossession continues to take place to date. And I'm trying to make an argument that dispossession is not a colonial or apartheid phenomenon. It's a continuous experience for mining affected communities. I'm also trying to say that dispossession does not just encompass the loss of the land, which is the material thing. There's also intangible loss, the loss of what we don't always see, right? Which are people's connections to the land. And so that's what I'm going to speak to in this project. And apologies, I've got my daughter who's screaming in the background, and I think I might take a moment to ask that they keep quiet. So here, Tendele coal mine in Somkhele has been mining the area since 2007. And this is an open cast mine, and they have been mining the area in phases. And so here is a little map of the areas that they've been mining, and it's a little bit unclear, but area one is what I'll focus on today, which covers areas such as Emaklibini and surrounding villages. Now, this is a standard contract of what they offer to communities when they relocate them in Somkhele. And this actually is not even happening in other areas, such as Tweefontein, where, Glencoe, for instance, was involved in the relocation of families. So this is a standard contract. As you see, they entered into by Tendele, Nebagwa Mbuyazi, Ubabu Josia. He was born in 1949. As you can see, a little bit of his identity number there. And the contract states that they will be relocated and that they've spoken to the Mpugunyoni Tribal Authority in agreement. Sorry, I just need to take this moment to ask Manny to shift my daughter. I am truly sorry about this because I can hear her at the background.
No problem, Danielle.
This is the nature of this time we live in. So we'll just give Dineo a moment and we will continue shortly. Dineo is back. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. So Bagwambuyazi, here on the contract, it states that they will receive a cash payment, right? And it says elected to receive a payment as if they've got an option or a choice. And so if you look there at the bottom, so they've been allocated 160,000, 75,000. This is his father, Umbongeni Mbuyazi. And at the bottom, and that's 135. All of it in total, it's 370. Now, to many people, 370 looks like it's a lot of money, but I just wanted to break it down to you so that you see what it covers. Now, it covers Induna's site fee. It covers the cost of relocation, sanitation. the erection of services such as electricity and water connections. So it's also covering the loss of crops of fields and so on. But it also states there on 3.3 that it also covers practices and rights relating to the exhumation and reburial of their family graves. So when you think about it, this compensation is actually very little compared to what it's expected to cover. And so I began to speak to the families which have been relocated in Somkele, as well as those who have lost their ancestral graves. And Ubabu Magubani, this is what he had to say when he recounted the early days of the mining company. He said, they called us. At the time, we had Chief Mkwanazi. We were told that the mine is coming. We were promised jobs. They said that no one will be poor. They said if you have a tractor and a van, you could use these in the mines to generate an income. So we agreed, seeing that the chief had already agreed. The mine's approach was to tell us about the upcoming mining plans. So note, tell us. So they're not asking, it's not a negotiated process. We were not asked about whether we wanted the mine. We were told by the chief. The mine never kept any of its promises. I had a tractor and a truck, which I had to sell. So Baba Magubani had bought a tractor and a truck in hopes to sebenza emayeni, but when they didn't take him, he had to sell these. And Umam Kwanazi, this is what she had to say, and they were relocated from Imakabini in 2008. At first, they said we're not going to be relocated. To my surprise, later on, I saw boys erecting a mine fence inside my yard. When I said, but I thought the mine will not affect me, they said, this is an instruction from the mine. The boys then said the next time they came, sorry ma, we need to remove you and the house. They had a tractor, ngakhala sisi, ngakhala ngaze ngathula bayidiliza, so they were demolishing her house. And so it's not just the relocation of their homesteads that is involved, particularly in the study that I'm undertaking, but it's also the relocation of their ancestral graves, which is actually core to my area of work. And as you can see, so those are some of the graves which have been relocated from the homesteads, and now they've been put in what is now a public cemetery, and they're facing over there a coal mine dump. And I spoke to some of the families once more who have experienced the relocations, and this is what they had to say. Our graves were dug and relocated. We did not know that graves can be relocated. We had 8 graves. They only gave me a cow and a goat for these. I'm trying to follow up on this matter unsuccessfully. I've asked because when you bury someone, you slaughter a cow per person, even if these are multiple people that died. When we questioned, we were told that Ngeza, the traditional council, instructed the mine to give us a cow and a goat each. And Ubaba Mbuyazi had this to say. I had 4 graves, my father, my child, and my 2 grandchildren. My father was born in 1913. He died in 2000, in August. My grandchild died in 2001 and the other in 2004. We were called to the mine. They said they will relocate graves and gave us a date. They then died. My family didn't want to go. I went alone. We found blankets. I took mats in which they would place the remains. I found a blanket which was still covering my father's remains. And Ubaba Ndlazi as well has said during the conversation that I had with him, Babeyemba ngamapiki, omunye wethu nje bamkhiphe assignment ingubo yakhe. Basinike ogabhoko hayi lezi ngubo esazibambathise zona. Meaning they provided prison-like blankets for our remains, not the blankets we used to put on the deceased, and they were using pick and shovel to exhume our ancestral remains. And he says, noma banye bangasekho amathambo bese kuwumhlabathi bewuthela kulo gabhoko lomhlabathi. So they were putting the remains on these prison-like blankets, and that they didn't find the bones, and this is because depending on the age of the grave, the remains after going through decomposition, they also sometimes go through the process of fossilization. So, but that depends on the age of the grave. And Ubabuzwani had this to say, Uma kuzokuzo, kwakunalo mshini we-TLB, so there was a TLB machine. Kwakukhona labo bantu abebathi makumbiwa bathi nali ibhokisi. There were people who could point and say, there's the coffin. Babebasusa ngamafosholo. Babebenza nje kwakungahlelekile, so it wasn't organized. Lelo bhokisi enaningcwabe ngalo nithola lingasekho ngoba seligugile. So you find that the coffin would have decomposed, so you don't sometimes find it, but also it depends because some families do not use coffins to bury. They inter the body straight to the soil. So into esuka ibe khona yingubo. Akuhlekile ngoba nami ngangikhomba ngithi bamba nali thambo ligcina lishona le. It wasn't organized because I was also pointing out and saying, watch out, there's a bone. It wasn't organized. Ube ubona ekhanda ngapha nangu nomshini we-TLB. You could see the skull there, but on the other side, there's a TLB machine. And Ubabu Gumede said, I'll be honest with you, for my mother, I received a kettle and a goat. We had 2 graves, including my siblings. These were old. Kumama umasimba sathola ikhanda lilodwa nethambo lesinga nalo selihlukene. We found my mother's skull and the hip bone. Her skeleton had separated. And so this is where they've placed the ancestral graves, as I've indicated, right next to a mining dump. And they didn't mark these properly. And so the markers have been lost. And as a result, people have actually lost their ancestral graves. And it's been estimated that at least 300 graves are missing. Of course, this is a number that we also would like to verify. But it does actually make sense, given that in homesteads, some people would have 9 to 11 graves. And so when these are relocated, they are placed in a public cemetery. And so if each family could have 4 to 9 ancestral graves, generational, you can see how we can actually get to that number. And here again, this is where they've been put. Again, there aren't markers. And so the families know which cemeteries their loved ones are in, but they do not know specifically which grave it is. And here as well, some of the graves have actually sunk in, and also water sometimes sort of sits right at the top when it's raining on the pit. Now, when I started asking them about the missing graves, this is what he said. We went and asked someone inside the mine, as well as North Coast, but they all said they can't find our graves. North Coast said we should have put topsoil earlier so that our graves do not get lost. When we asked about the solution to finding our graves, we're told that we can stand at the cemetery's gate and speak to our ancestors. I was shocked. And I asked him, how does this make him feel? And he said, Kunzima kakhulu, I sometimes go and look. So I sometimes lose my mind. And it's very difficult. And this is what I call in my work, spiritual insecurity. And Ubabu Dlamini said, we had 2 graves, Esther Nsweli, my mother, and Haugile Dlamini, my aunt. I don't remember when my mother was born. I was born in 1963. We knew who is who, even if we did not have markers. So they didn't have markers in the homestead. So how are we to know who they are now that they are in a public cemetery? They said they will erect tombstones. That's how we lost our graves. We saw where they are at the time, but now they have reburied many graves. So we lost ours. And Ubabum Seli said, it's a struggle now because I can't go there now to my father and speak to him. My belief is that I can't go to the cemetery site and call him because you attract other spirits. So it's important to go directly to his grave. Otherwise, you need a traditional healer. And he gave me this humorous example, and he said, "Asithi omunye wasekhaya owashona kwakuMakhosonke." So, for example, let's say one of the people who had died was Makhosonke. Ngifika ngibize uMakhosonke. I go to the cemetery, public cemetery, and call uMakhosonke. Uthola ukuthi bathathu uMakhosonke. Bazongilandela bonke labo Makhosonke, abanye banomoya omubi. So when you go to the cemetery and call Makhosonke, you're calling all the Makhosonkes in the cemetery with different spirits, and so they follow you. And he said, "Ufaka udoti ekhaya," so you're bringing a very bad spirit home. That's what's happening. And my argument is that this is happening because when mining companies see, for instance, Indlu Gogo, which is this is an ancestral, a sacred ancestral home made with mud, right, or concrete, and with a thatched roof. It looks like a very replaceable structure, and so do they again when they see in ancestral graves. And this is what I call material reductionism in my work, which is seeing structures that can be easily replaced, moved from one position to another. Similar to when they see a cattle kraal, they see a very replaceable structure, which is simply erected using they use sort of sticks which you can find within the fields and so on. And so for them, for the mining company, these are replaceable structures which can be erected elsewhere. And so what they do not understand is that, for instance, endlini yagogo siyangena, siyaphahla, siyakhuluma emsamo, people inform their ancestors ukuthi siyakhala sinenkinga ethize, we've got a particular problem, noma siyacela noma siyabonga, they give thanks. And so people actually have rituals that they conduct to connect to their ancestors. And so the space is quite sacred. And when that is actually uprooted, people go through what I call spiritual insecurity. And one of the problems, again, is that mining companies use what is a market-driven approach, which is to calculate and to say, well, you've got 3 homes, given that people, for instance, in homesteads have got izindlu ezihlukene, depending on whether they're polygamous or not. And so they'll calculate and put these, for instance, in a list, as you would have seen in that contract, in the contract. And so all of these seem like replaceable structures, which you can calculate, arrive at a number, but they do not quite understand the sacred meaning behind every space, particularly for these communities. But also what is happening is that you've got legislative gaps, for instance, which stipulate that there should be consultation, but it doesn't quite stipulate what constitutes adequate consultation. And so then a consultation becomes just a tick box exercise, but it's not meaningful. It's not including communities to actually participate in political binding decisions. But also there's issues around compensation. And at the moment, there isn't any law that's stipulating around how much should you compensate communities when they're being dispossessed. And that's one of the areas of contestation. But also, I think the biggest problem here, I think, which my work is highlighting, is that when you put the MPRDA, which is the mineral law in South Africa, we beg with the Heritage Act, and KZN has got its own Heritage Act, which is another problem. And you put it together with the PILRA, which is People's Informal Land Rights. When you put all of those together in the legislation, the mineral law actually trumps all the legislation, because the mining company would be seeking profit, and they're obviously working with DMR and with a minister who's very invested in mining and calling it a sunrise economy, right? So just in closing, what I'm arguing here in my work is that we've got lawful exclusion, in which the legislation or the laws which were meant to actually restore or bring about justice in communities is now excluding communities, but within the ambit of the law. And so those gaps are being exploited by mining companies. to then exclude people, but within the legal framework. And so then what happens here is that this continuous dehumanization of African people are dispossessed when they are that they are removed because of mining and placed next to a mine dump. That mine dump or mining is really a constant site of what caused the dispossession, but it's also a constant site for when people are dead. And so then that explains why you don't have a final place to rest or the last place to rest following that conversation that we had no cis medical Nziba, which is one of the activists that I worked with in KZN. So I will stop here and then we'll allow for questions much later on. Thank you, Mbongiseni.
Thank you very much, Dineo. Without further ado, we'll move straight on to Mbuso. Mbuso, over to you, 15 minutes.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I see that I'm not allowed to switch on my camera, so I'll switch it on once I'm given access to that. Uma ngasithola isikhathi to conclude, I think for me, udaba esibukane nalo ngokubona kwami really ukuguqula indlela esibuka ngayo umhlaba enkathini edlule. And that's why then my title is Whose Eyes Are Looking at the History of Dispossession. And in my presentation, I want to look at various case studies in which dispossession has been looked at, and arrive at a theory of an eye. And hence I ask whose eyes are looking at the history of dispossession. There are the eyes of the state, the eyes of those who are dispossessed, the eyes of the dead, and the eyes of the farmer, or those as well who work the land. So those are the various eyes that I have in this, and I might not get the chance to look at every case. So I'll just try and condense everything. My research starts in the 1950s during a potato boycott, 1959 in Mpumalanga, what was then Eastern Transvaal in Bethal, where South Africans in 1959 started to say that they will not consume potatoes. And the reason from the communities was that they will not consume potatoes because potatoes looked like humans. Why did they say this? Well, it was discovered that farms in Bethal were using prison laborers to work the land. And as a result, farmers were quite brutal and killed those that worked the land, and then interred them in the field, and then planted potatoes just on those unmarked graves. So the assumption was that because the potatoes were planted on the graves of the dead, the potatoes came back looking like humans, hence there was no need anymore to consume the potatoes. So I guess my case is a case of the dead coming back and speaking for themselves, while Dineo has been looking at how the graves are being, or the dead are being disturbed. But in this case, the dead come back and speak for themselves. So let me go back a bit in history, 1913, and look at one case of the grave through Saul Blach. I'll start with this story of the Khobadi family. Ms. Khobadi carried a sick baby when they were evicted from the farm. 2 days out, the little one began to sink as the result of privation and exposure on the road. Its little soul was released from its earthly bonds. They, the Khobadi family, had no right or title to the farmlands through which they trekked. They must keep to the public roads, the only place in the country open to the outcast if they are possessed of a traveling permit. The deceased child had to be buried, but where, when, and how? This young wandering family decided to dig a grave under the cover of darkness of that night when no one was looking, and in that crude manner, the dead child was interred and interred amid fear and trembling, as well as the throbs of a torturing anguish in a stolen grave, lest the proprietor of the spot or any of his servants should surprise them in the act. The anguish of dispossession in South Africa is neither the untold truths nor the many spoken truths of how a family in the place of their birth ended up stealing a grave. The anguish comes from the eyes of the ones who had to steal the grave and bury their own in a hurry. As if that is not enough, that moment of dispossession is thought of today as part of a vile past that is no longer relevant to us. Instead, I argue the history of dispossession in South Africa should be seen as part of our historical present. Our history is forever present in our social order. To locate it, we need to look deep into South Africa's vast hectares of land. What we might excavate would not only be earthly, but will also reveal the deeper meaning of dispossession. That once people are removed from the land, not only do they become laborers, but they also become criminals, whose entire being is a search to nowhere. This is a condition I call a condition of ontological nowhereness, as exemplified in the story I just told about the Khobadi family who lost their daughter and had to bury the child in a stolen grave. And we see this in how Solomon Plaatje documented the 1913 Land Act, that it made criminals of all those Black people or the labor tenants who refused to abide by the law, which stipulated that they would become servants of the farmer and work the land along with their cattle. So Plaatje encountered families in Bloemhof, Transvaal, who had become criminals as a consequence of this resistance. These families had trekked into land unknown to them, risking capture and the charge of trespassing. They were traveling with stock, and their ownership of it might be questioned. Many had thought that the law was only applicable in the Orange Free State and ignored warnings that it also applied in other parts of the Union of South Africa. All natives without land were turned into servants, and those who resisted were, in the words of Solomon Plaatje, wandering to somewhere. The Khobadi family was one such. Not only had they lost their cattle in the trek, but they also lost their offspring in the cold night and had to steal a grave to bury that child. Through the child's death, the Khobadi family were staring at their future, a future which they did not know where they would be buried or where they would die. This story of dispossession expresses this ontological nowhereness aptly. Deep within the story is a revelation of how dispossession creates the burden of not belonging to the land, nor having a place called home, being forced to make means in the city, potentially criminalized for not producing a pass, as was the case with Bethel. So when the dispossessed Khobadi family looked at the vast landscape of South Africa, their eyes were looking into a past, the present, and their future. It was a past snatched violently from them and a present that they refused to accept. Their eyes were looking into a future filled with hope that despite the loss in the past, there would surely be a place that they would make home and be buried there. If they did not keep moving, they would be without a grave. So if they had no hope for the future, they could easily return to their past in the Free State, to an environment they were familiar with. Yet they continue to drag, losing hope, losing possession, losing life, losing their future through the death of their livestock and their offspring. So who knows what promise they made as they interred their seed. So the Khobadi family was also looking at the land through what I call an eschatological gaze. This was a spiritual look at the land that they saw as their first and last destiny for their spirit, to create a home and be buried in this land as a spiritual activity. This eschatological gaze is not limited to how the dispossession saw their fate. In Bethel, when people were looking at potatoes and said, these potatoes look like humans, theirs was an eschatological gaze as well, a statement not coming from a person betrayed by their eye who ends up seeing the impossible, but about an eye that already sees the truth in what is perceived, a human potato. So what I'm trying to do here now is map the eye as well as a prejudice organ. And I'm bringing on a puzzle or a conundrum that in appreciating the story of dispossession, And at the same time, when we appreciate this story, how then do we think of an eye as a prejudice organ? Because the eye is shaped by the time. And that's why I asked the question of whose eyes are looking at history, because it becomes important if we are to ascertain the meaning of the history of dispossession. So I follow the eyes of the people who no longer had a home in the country of their birth to understand the meaning of this uncertainty and their relationship with this new state of existence. So today, our eyes must appropriate the look that is given to the land by those who have been discredited. Through these eyes, we will conclude that our present is steeped in a past that entailed death in the making of South African farm. And we will see that what dispossession is and how it relates to the future and our current temporality. To see with a spiritual eye. In 2014, Gogo Mshanelo Bongegile Nonhlanhla Nkomo, a sangoma from MSing, detailed how she was haunted in her visions or sleep by ghosts who demanded to be set free as you have freed others, to have their spirits released. In isiZulu, this is called uboniswa, a spiritual moment when ancestors bring visions to the sight of the divine. These visions relate to the present or the future. Thus, uboniswa is to see with a spiritual eye. In her visions, she would see scores of people who were bent and some without limbs, stretching their arms towards her, demanding their freedom. She tried ignoring their call for freedom, but they began manifesting through her body, tormenting her, to a point where she became sick and had unexplained bruises and lost her teeth. So who were these people who were so vicious in their demand for freedom? The response was that they were souls, I quote, wandering, searching for peace and freedom. Gogo Mshanelo would later discover that these bodies that she saw were buried on Leroy Farm in Dududu on the south coast of KwaZulu-Natal, and the farm now owned by Ilovo Shuga. And please note that Gogo Mshanelo resides in MC, which is approximately 253 kilometers away from Dududu. So the Sangoma tried various ways to alert the government of these dreams, but she failed, but later on managed to gain access to the farm. And then as she got to the farm, they discovered that there were graves, unmarked graves there. And then they alerted the MEC. From there on, they started digging those graves and then discovered that the 100 unmarked graves belong to the prison laborers. And the community also attested that the farmer who owned the farm before Ilovo was an evil man who was responsible for torturing and killing prison laborers on the farm between 1950 and 1980. So therefore, the bones were likely to belong to prison laborers sent to work on the farm through the petty offender scheme. So those who were buried on that farm were classified as criminals, I mean. So Willendorf, who worked on the farm and resided in the area, indicated that those who worked on the farm, I quote, were buried like dogs, and there are many prisoners who died there. And once a prisoner had died, the workers would just dig a hole and bury them in an unmarked grave. And we called the place where they were buried, as in Tanzania, the place of offense, end of quote. This was known as the place of offense because those who died were treated and buried as if they did not belong or have parents, but also because those who died left many orphans behind. So the pain of being buried like a dog is one that many prison laborers feared, and it reminded them of the brutality of being homeless or of not belonging, or what I've called ontological nowhereness. So what we discover through these unmarked graves is that when we look at the case of Betal and now the discovery of Dududu, is that burying of people on the land and concealing their grave was not a new phenomenon. However, the specters of Dududu remind us of the inadequacy sometimes of the language of legality to account for those who were landless, homeless, nameless, body and soul tortured, as I will show. And these officials that went to Dududu were digging up a past, but needed tools to understand if indeed the dead were victims of an unjust past. The eye of Gogo Mshanelo was doubted because it was a spiritual eye that saw the spirits of the dead before any evidence had surfaced. So through Gogo Mshanelo, we learned that the eye is not only an organ that sees things in the physical state, but sees in the spiritual state as well. So the eye of Gogo Mshanelo was not enough. And on 14 March 2015, the state requested the forensic expert David Hlazo to aid them in making the past speak truth and justice. Hlazo indicated that the scene, I quote, and the wider era around it will now be sealed off and frozen in time. There must be no disturbance of it with a front loader or shovel. It must be excavated as one would do an archaeological site. So this site of archaeological interest, frozen in time, was to speak of the unknown injustices of the past, the Sangom, or for the Sangom, and the bones for the expert were to speak of their condition and allow us in the present to understand the past. The name of the Sangoma is important here. Mshanelo, which translates to broom, is significant, for as a broom she had the ability, which was recognized by the dead, to sweep below and even beyond what can be seen. The unearthing power of the broom allows us to go beneath the surface and reveal things we have forgotten or never imagined to exist. Ugogo Mshanelo could not only sweep and reveal, she could also allow the wandering spirits to receive their freedom. I think I'll need 2 more minutes, and to find solace. The bones became an archival source for the forensic expert to speak of the violence inflicted on them and then be allowed to rest and find their freedom. But the problem was that these dead bodies were nameless and faceless, and it was difficult to find and notify their families. The burden fell on the living or their families, if located, to come and claim their deceased with the assistance of forensic experts. So in a sense, this archive in the form of specters spoke for itself, using the body of the Sangoma as a medium, and through her discontent, pain, violence, the ghost could be personified, for they manifested themselves through her body. The ghost demanded freedom and could not be ignored until excavated, but unfortunately, the process of excavation has served the purpose of archiving, which encourages the remembrance of the dead only to be forgotten once again. The bones revealed the horror in the history of South African farms, but the case seems to be forgotten since there's been no follow-up. And I remember last year when I called David Hlazo to follow up on the case, he said he has sold his law practice and 6 years is a long time ago. And this came as a shock, especially given this utterance about freezing time. So just to conclude, I would not be able to have time to capture everything. So what kind of freedom is demanded by the dead? So much so that in their death, they can still extend their arms to the living. The problem is clear to see. Dispossession as a condition of denying Black people freedom also meant that even in their death, they could not find rest peaceful. So then dispossession appears today as well as a spiritual question for us to use different eyes to look at, to free the past, to free ourselves, the spirit, and then learn from the tragedy of nowhereness. I think I'll end it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mbuso. I neglected to say that Mbuso is a lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Pretoria. So we go from the first two speakers, the good doctors, Kosana and Nkosi, and now we move on to a practitioner. Simon Gash is an artist and a filmmaker. Over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to speak today a little bit about one of my films called Working the Land, which explored the processes of dispossession and restitution in Salem in the Eastern Cape. There's a link to the film in the program if anyone wants to see the full film. And it's part of a series of 3 films, and the films are kind of independent, so you can watch them on their own, but they also kind of build on each other. The research and interviews for this film, I just want to say from the beginning, was done in collaboration with the journalist Naren Tulsi, and we worked together a lot on the process of these interviews. And I started looking at Salem originally because it's actually where my family arrived in 1820, and they were part of the original dispossession of that land. And the films were meant to be about the story of my ancestor Richard Gush and his arrival, but quickly became about the land claim in Salem. And that land claim was happening at the time when I started the research. And it's a claim that received a fair amount of publicity as it went up to the Constitutional Court, where there was a fairly unique judgment based on the history of the land as a commonage, a shared land, where the judgment was that the land be shared between the claimants and the current landowners.
Recording in progress.
To look more closely at some of the problems that were being experienced in terms of getting the farms running, and particularly getting the farms running after the restitution, and some of these problems that were being experienced, and I think, I mean, in a way, some of these might seem obvious, but they become very large hurdles to get over. But also the accumulation of these problems, I think, is really important. And the first one is a lack of government support. It's either that the support is difficult to access. It's often not clear how to access the support. The support is often not sufficient. And another problem was that even when support was accessed, that it would disappear. So there's an example that on one of the farms where seeds were provided, where money for labor was provided at the beginning, but it immediately, as the crops were growing, the government disappeared. They didn't return with the follow-up funds, and so on, and so the crops eventually had to be abandoned. And I mean, I think it's really a real problem in terms of the fact that it does take a lot of capital to get a farm running, and this also relates to the problem that it's incredibly hard to generate a profit in the agricultural sector with small-scale farms, particularly because this industry has been structured on low wages. And another sort of major problem that was being faced by the emerging black farmers was the problem of racism within the sector, and discrimination that they were facing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show some short clips from the film to try and give you a sense. I hope this works properly on Zoom. It's sometimes difficult to do video over Zoom, but let's see if we can get this to work. So in this first clip, it's from a meeting of the Salem community with the Community Property Association shortly after the judgment had come through. And it takes place on one of the farms in Salem. And what comes up in this part of the meeting is some of the anxiety around this idea of sharing the land. And this is in the context of many of the people who were at this meeting who had worked on these farms, who worked for the white farmers, who are now being forced to share their land. And this is within a kind of history of work, but also of racism and violence on these farms.
Now, what about as pharmacy silikwinani nanzika kufuneka babambe siza kuhlala njani siza kwenza njani akuzoba khona ka-skill la kulizini ukuba wena kule uhlala kule farm then le farm kama yeyethu sonke masihlale kuye sonke wena uzawuhlala still kulaa yakho yemfuyo. Now akuzoba nayo i-attitude esayithini into yobana ndinguqeshwa wakho ungalibali into yobana into isilevel akuzobakho ungquzulwana kudalwa ungquzulwane phakathi kwethu ngoba andikholwa into yobana ungangcekivwa ngumntu ubomi bakho bonke tuthi uzokutsho namhlanje sinezindlu namhlanje notata wasweleka utata esilwa lemhlaba ephansi kwezuluvo lwakho siphinde nditye sinye sinye nawe.
Okay. So the next clip that I'm going to show is of Lungiswa Madinda, whose family are the caretakers on Castle Farm in Salem. And it talks a little bit to the experience of the exclusion that the black commercial farmers were facing in the area.
Before you show that clip, Simon, can I just remind everybody to please mute themselves? We're getting some noise from people who are not muted. Please mute yourselves. Thanks, Simon. Proceed, please.
Sure.
The white people, they're doing their things different. We are different from them now. If they have the meeting, they have their meeting, their own meeting. Like the people here, they have their own meeting here. I don't know. Because we need to be, because we also to be, we are in the farm also. We also, if there's a meeting, like the security meeting, we're supposed to be there. Because those things happening around, they will affect also us. Second, there's still that apartheid. It's there.
Okay, and then so finally, I want to show another clip. It's that is also of Lungiswa and her brother, and they're talking a little bit about the problems that they face in terms of accessing markets, of the struggles in terms of the fact that when they try and sell cattle at auction, that they receive lower prices than the white farmers. And then I've chosen clips from Castle Farm, I think, because Castle Farm is quite interesting in terms of the fact that they were, of the farms, the most successful in terms of getting the farm up and running, but then we're still facing all these kind of hurdles in terms of how to actually make the farms work.
We plant ourselves. We didn't have some people to help us. It was also only us. Also the beans, also the potatoes, the seeds we just get from agriculture. Because we go there and knock there, and they help us. And we harvest them. We have a lot of mealies. I think about we have 60 bags, 50 kgs. But the market was so difficult for us. And also the beans. The beans will sell around Grahamstown. We don't have the market.
No, it's not easy. It's not easy at all. because I believe that especially it's a problem with the white farmers. I don't think they are feeling comfortable to accept us as black farmers in the market. And I believe that if we can have some sort of working together in that, I'm sure we can do more.
If you sell your cows there in Stockholm, that person who was talking there, he will ask you, whose car is this? If it is for the black people, it will go down. If it is for the white people, for them, they know each other. They say it's for Mr. Who, they Mr. Who and Who, it will go up. So we just sell our cows we just lost there lots of money there, but you don't have the place to sell.
Okay. So I think, so the film deals a lot with this kind of frustration and anger within these communities around their struggles to get the farms running and the problems with the lack of work. But I think what I was interested in trying to think about is what this might also say about the process of restitution. And the question that I was trying to kind of ask is the question of what is being restituted. So what was dispossessed and what is being restituted? So what happens when land is taken in one economic and social system, where land is at the center, where it provides a basis for so much, where it has multiple meanings, but is returned within a capitalist system as a productive asset, and the kind of pressures that it then exerts in terms of providing work, generating a profit, and asking whether we can, I think, have a more expansive idea of what restitution is that takes into account the other things that were lost that go beyond just this idea of land as an asset. And to think, is there a way to think around restitution that it is not sort of constrained by this idea of work or by labor, so that it's not just about working the land, but it's also about a process of returning the land and living on the land. Okay.
Simon, are you showing us another clip?
No, I think I've already gone well over my 15 minutes.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm just going to make two comments and then invite discussion. So I think the first thing that these presentations, when taken together, make quite clear to us, I'm just thinking of the time span of these presentations. So Simon is talking about processes going back to the 19th century, the 1820s settlers, where Mboso touches on 1913, things like Solplaike. And then we go to 1959 in Mboso's presentation. We go to 2014, and we go to an even more recent conversation he had with the lawyer following up. Dineo similarly spends that whole time. And what I think we see here is that the kinds of dispossession that have happened are indeed dispossession of land as a physical asset, but over that time, they span also other forms of dispossession. What strikes me quite forcefully here in Dineo's talk is the impoverishment, which is both material, or not both, but it's actually three things. Material, it's social. When people get displaced, they lose their immediate community when they get placed in a new place where they have to learn to live, perhaps not with people who were their neighbors previously, but learn to live anew with other people. But the most significant is the spiritual loss, what Mboso calls the ontological nowhereness. that he contrasts what happened in 1913 with what happens during apartheid, the Bethel, the use of farm labor, of prison labor on farms. The thing that also quite strikes me in having these presentations against each other like this is that, as Muso says, that the dead also get to speak. They speak for themselves at later periods. And it's a question of who's seeing the land and how they are seeing it. But I think it's a question of who's hearing the dead. And in the case of Gogo Mshanelo, she's able to hear the dead and to get processes going so that there's the restoration, there's a finding of peace, there's a hearing of those voices. So with that, let me then stop here and pause and invite conversation. I'm going to ask that as it's just to remind all of us, where people who are participating online, we're being asked to put comments in the chat function. We're not able to take comments live. People who are in the venues in Johannesburg, Durban, and East London, let's invite you to make comments. I'll start with Durban. Is there anybody in the room who would like to make a comment or ask a question? And I'd like to encourage us also to just, this is the first day is really surfacing. What are the issues? We've heard some of the issues here. It's dispossession, restitution that is incomplete, where people are not given adequate support. But it's also people being thrown together. Again, the social loss. People being thrown together on these farms, they're having to share the land and having to find a way of living together, which is very difficult. Some people hold power. People who've had their land restored are unable to enter into some of those networks that they need to enter into to be successful as farmers. Let's hear what takes other experiences. Seeing East London, is there somebody ready to speak in East London?
Durban.
Okay, Durban, please go ahead.
We just need 5 minutes for translations, and then
please, yes,
people will be able to ask questions from them. Can we just
Thank
get
you.
5 minutes?
Take 5 minutes, yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Dispossession ba fetša ba inyenyefatša ba lebeletše gore ke tšhelete a ba lebelele taba tša moya ba lebeletše gore na lefase leo mmarakeng ke bokae ene ge ba dira dispossession ye nngwe ge ba tšeela batho mabu ye nngwe ba lebelela taba ya melao ye itšeng o tshwana le ya mine le bo iphelera mara ge ba fetša ga ba lebelele dilo tša setšo le bodumedi mo leng gore go ra gore ge ba tšeela batho mabu ga ba tšeele fela batho mabu go ne le ditokelo tša bodumedi tša go rapela setšo le meletlo ye leng gore ba re tšeetše yona ene ga ba ke ba di lebelela mo gore ke tlhotlho ye kgolo ye leng gore o e beile go rena rena re reng ka yona goba wena go ikwa presentation ya gage ke eng se o bonang gore se sa tlhaela
case study ya gage ya Dineo ke ya ko Tendele mine ko Somkhele ko KZN mo e leng gore ga ba batla go mine ba epolotse mabitla so o na a quota someone o na bua gore ke ne ka bona greater e tsamaya ka lerapo la motho ke a ipotsa gore yaanong ga go ntse yana tulo ya rona ya bofelo ya go ikhutsa ke e feng ha ile gore rona re bitsa go gae re itse tulo ya mabitla ya tlhompiwa yaanong gona no ha setse ba dirile yana rona tulo ya rona ya go ikhutswa ya bofelo ke e feng
ba ga tla ke se so banye presentation ya ga Mbuso Nkosi ona bua ka matlho a lebeletseng history ya dispossession gore tlhwiswe bjang a research ga ge se mo
Hi everyone, I see that there's questions taking place in the different venue. If you are supposed to be heard by all, and then I would recommend that you kindly unmute yourself so that everyone can hear what's going on. Thank you.
ya le be re ga pap ditapole tse di tlhoga tse e be di tlhoga e nna kete ke batho ke ba gana go di jona no te ka se ditapole tse le go ke sa batho
We are at 5 minutes, so just checking with Durban, East London, Joburg. Are you ready to rejoin us? Can we take discussion?
le di-farmers ba neng ba re hirile kere ba ntse gore re kgone gore re ba lemele yalo le yalo ba ne ba gana batho gore ba fele ba boloke batho o file sekai ka ngwana o seleng a tlhokofala a ke ra bona ka gare o mongwe e be nna gore ngwana a gana gore a bolokiwe mo lefatsheng leo ke a batla tshwana gore ba khupune bosigo bo boloka ngwana o.
Thank you.
So
Reverend Mavuso, okay, is just stepping off in Durban. So let's take discussion. I'm not seeing, I'm seeing Johannesburg. I think somebody is still translating. Let's give them time to wrap up.
So ke mathata ya le bosigo tshwantse le khukhunele le boloka batho ke setlhogo se se dirwa ke maburu ba gaetso yaanong setlhogo seo ga se felele fontse se tswelela pele yaanong tlhaloganye gore dipelo tsa batho ba ba tlhokofetseng di a lla le ka matlho a bona ba kgona bona yaanong ba retela yaanong gona gore yaanong ba tla yaka in the form of dipoko yaanong a ke ra bona gore mare gore re isiwa mo lefatsheng la rona setlhogo yana a ke ra bona so ke se mbuso nkosi a le ka go se bua gore so se se diragalang sa go tlisiwa ko mafatsheng ke maburu se tsa se tswelela pele le gona nonyana a ke ra bona so se tswa kwa lowe le ka tse go tse se le teng bagaetso. Oh.
So Simon Kashena ona bua ka film e leng gore wila idira around lefatshe le leng gore
East London, are we all meant to be hearing this input?
And then lefatshe le le ko Salem gona mo South Africa e realize that film thola gore gona le a land claim around that land ne lefatshe leo and then bogolo I think in his presentation ke taba gore una botsa potso e leng gore I think all the speakers ba butsitse ke taba ya gore hele la tlhagelwa ke lefatshe o la tlhagelwa ke eng ne a se fela tse e leng gore ra di bona le gore ha o buisetswa lefatshe o buisetswa eng and a bua ka taba ya gore gona yanong lefatshe he re latlhegetswe ke lefatshe nako le pre-1994 ka nako tsa bo di-colonialism dikgatelelo but gona yanong he re busetswa lefatshe under a capitalist system agere ya makepitale mo e leng gore lefatshe tshwantse e be ile gore ke ntho e leng gore gona go e sebedisa e re feletseno le itseng la tšhelete o mebereko e itseng and gagolo mo dipuong tsa rona re bua ka taba ya gore it must be productive agere re batla mebereko re batla gore le leme so land must be productive and he re bolela yalo re latlhegelwa ke taba gore lefatshe le botlhokwa ka tsela tse dingwe tse dintsi wa bona not just in terms of tšhelete le mebereko so a bua gore tshwantse re be le kore monagano mogolo o leng gore o lolamile ka taba ya gore ya go busetswa mafatshe re ska lebella fela taba ya tšhelete le mebereko yes I mean I think ke yona eo Oscon but significant bogologolo ke taba gore ke potso e leng gore all of them are asking gore restitution go buisetswa ga lefatshe ke ntho e le kgolo le go latlhegela go botlhokwa ka ditsela tse ding ka ntle le
Thank you. Can we take discussion, please?
tse re di bonang ka matlo.
Thank you, Bahul.
I see in Johannesburg, somebody has the mic. Can we hear Johannesburg?
And ge o tlo bua ke kopa gore o tlo eme mo le ba khone go bona ba khutlwe. And then stulo ke sene ke bona
Sorry, somebody is speaking in Johannesburg. We can see in the picture. Can we hear them, please?
Let's make a line.
Durban, I'm going to just ask you to hold since somebody's already at full voice here in Johannesburg.
Sorry, Chair, they're not responding to my message to them to unmute.
Okay, I think we'll take Durban then, if we can. Durban is unmuted.
Hello?
Yes, please go ahead.
Ngibonge mphathi wohlelo. Kulama discussion noma le presentation eyethulwe eqaleni yakwaSomkhele eThembele. Kahle into eyenzeka lapha yakwaSomkhele ku-traumatize umphakathi. Cause ayikho into abayizuzayo ngale yamayini leyana elaphana. Kuyihlazo-ke ukuthi nondaba ezitha bethu bayathinteka lapha. Lento iyabakitaza ngoba bathenjiswa izinto engawusizi ngalutho umphakathi. Uyabona ukuthi mangabe ukhalela amathambo abakini abangasekho ukuthi uyonikezwa inkomo nembuzi. Kuyihlazo lokho. Futhi nje akwemukelekile uhulumeni ovotelwe ngentando yeningi kwayena ubukeka elihlazo. Uhulumeni esinayo ubulihlazo. Kunalama entity kahulumeni ngizwile bekhuluma nebefaka nendaba ye-heritage. Mina nje lelo gama elithi heritage angifuni ukulithathina ngoba ilapho ngempela kwephucwa khona abantu amalungelo abo imihlaba yabo ukuthi bawuclaimile noma bawuclaimanga akusho lutho. Noma nazi imayini lezi zithatha imihlaba yabantu ukuthi bawuclaimile noma bawuclaimanga akusho lutho. Okwenzeka koBhetali ukuthi kusetshenziswe iziboshwa masifa siphenduka umanyolo. Uyayizwa leyo nto le ayizwakali kahle leyo nto. Akaze kuboshwe umuntu ukuze kube namhlakaluko. Kuyihlazo kwenzeka eSouth Africa. Ngiyabonga mphathi wohlelo.
Siyabonga nje ake siphinde sithole owesibili eThekwini ngaphambi kokuba siye eAst London. Our speaker there just briefly was saying what is happening in South Africa is shameful. It's shameful that traditional leaders are involved. They get promised trinkets, essentially, in these land dispossession matters, and they side with mining companies. It's also shameful that what happened in Bethel, where people died, people were put to work as prison labor on farms, and they were turned into fertilizer, and nobody has ever been held to account. This is shameful. It's a shame on our government that these things are happening today. Thank you. Sis Nonhle, over to you.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. This presentation was really good. Yeah, for me, what I just want to, it's not a question, it's just a comment on the issue of spirituality. You know, this is where our communities are always been, I don't know how can I call it, because the developers, they don't believe in our beliefs. They don't understand us as African. When they come to do their own development, a culture does not exist. What exists is profit. That is why they don't understand that the bone of a person is important for our spirit. Now, it's easy for them to bulldoze. And I'm just saying this because I've seen many issues when we try to speak about our culture, our way of living, that we need to explain ourselves to them. They are not willing to listen to us. We need to explain to them. And no matter how we explain, it doesn't mean anything because they always keep saying that your spirit cannot stop development. Development is more important than your spirit because we want to create jobs. That is where we lost as Africans because we jump for jobs. The jobs are not exist. These jobs are just promised jobs. And at the end of the day, we lost Ubuntu, we lost our spirit in the norm of jobs. And especially the things that you can't see. when we try to explain ourselves that there are things, because when they are coming to do their development, they just exactly as the comrade explained, that if you said, no, we have a rendezvous here, and this rendezvous is very important to me, and you'll never understand until I explain to you. They said that, no, we'll compensate you. Compensation it's not something that we want as African. What we want Ubuntu. Ubuntu, this is the thing that is being crushed left and center right now in order to put the capitalism in our communalism. Communalism, this is what it brings Ubuntu. But once communalism or socialism is being destroyed, we're going to experience all these issues that we're experiencing right now. This is the thing that we need to protect. We need to defend, no matter what cost, even if we've been killed, but we need to defend this. If we are not defending right now, that means there is no future for the next generation. That's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Nonke. Can we go to East London, please? We'll take 2 inputs from East London.
Okay, thank you. I am Sishuba. I'm not going to ask a question here, but to just give my input or a contribution towards these graves. I'm happy that it has been mentioned because it's one of the things that used to worry me a great deal. We've got the graves, the old graves where we used to stay, but during the removal, forceful removals, we left those graves there, and they are left there alone. No one is looking after them. During this, the soil erosion, those graves are being eroded. In some cases at home there are bones that are found lying in the rivers. Those are the bones of our forefathers, their skulls and the like. I'm worried because the world is changing each time. You see, there are new people who are arriving in our place who might eventually take the whole land. And those people might not respect those graves as we used to do. When they see those tombstones that are there, they may just throw them away and do whatever they like. They may take them and build the pigsties with the tombstones that are there. Now, I always want to advise that we ask the government to help us build strong graves there, stronger than what we have done, so that they are not destroyed in any case for years, something that would remain there for years, strong, very, very strong. If we could have just a very one big, what we call tombstone, where all the names of the people who are lying there or who have been buried there would be written on one tombstone, and then something very strong to cover the whole graves. Very, very strong. You see, that would provide work for our people during the time of erecting such structures. And that would also help us. We regard these things as our local heritage sites. where the families who love their forefathers would at some time make arrangement to go and pray there, worship in those places so as to keep them alive. When the new people who are conquering, in a process of conquering our place here come, they will never be able to destroy those things. Our children, the children to come, would be able to know that this land used to belong to these people. They will learn that. Thank you.
Thank you. May we have
I'm just
one
taking
other?
one more person in the East London.
Igama lam ndinomonde Phindani. Chairperson Diakolisa, I'm not going to talk about the graves and other things, but I just want to focus on the issue of land dispossession and women. I think all of us, we know that we live in a society that embraces patriarchy, male-dominated society. And when I was listening to Dineo speaking about the issue of consultation, the IPILRA, and how the traditional leaders get into agreements or into deals with these companies in terms of dispossessing people their land. You know, one thing that came into my mind is that we know that traditional leaders still regard women as minors. I mean, they still give women the status of a minor, you know, as it used to happen during the apartheid times. So, and I want us to understand how women are so negatively affected by land dispossession. One, if we understand that women are in majority in this country. Secondly, the majority of people that are unemployed in this country are women. Women rely on land to survive. Women rely on agriculture to survive. Women rely on forests to make woods, to make, you know, like, mainly women rely on nature to survive. And when the land gets, when women get no access to land, they suffer a lot. So I get so worried when we talk about land dispossession and we don't emphasize how women get so negatively affected by this issue, especially the issue of consultation, you know, because wherever you go, I mean, like, even if women are in the decision-making structures, but we know that those structures are still male-dominated. So I think it really worries me today that in this whole discussion, you know, the issue of women and lack of access to decision-making, and even on just participation. For instance, I know that even in traditional councils, we still have women that are represented there. But, you know, how effective is that? You know, are their voices taken seriously? So whenever we talk about land dispossession, for me, I think it's critical that we look at how women are so negatively affected by this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Chair. Sorry, Chair. We have questions from Joburg still.
Yeah, so we will take two questions from Joburg. I'm just going to ask, I'm informed that we are out of time. So I'm just going to ask that those inputs be short. I don't know if we have time to return to our speakers. If not, we will wrap up with these two questions or comments that we'll take from Joburg. Joburg, please.
My name is Christina Modau. I'm from Marikana, Maritlokwa. My question is basically based on the graveyards. We have problem regarding graves that are within our community. As now I know this is the reality happening for, even our graveyards are excavated by Thabisa Minerals Mine, knowingly, even though they know and they understand that certain families had their graveyards within their yard. but they were excavated. And we suffered another forceful relocation of the graveyards, whereby other family members are stated, rest in peace. And you cannot point who is your family member, who is your father, because now the graveyard, it is written, rest in peace. And we suffered another re-relocation of the graveyards again, whereby the graves were relocated to a place whereby it is mud. Water comes within the ground, and the graveyards disappeared within the ground. So we don't know what is government going to do about that, or how is government going to help us. But we think by today's session, we're going to have a better understanding regarding the graveyards. Thank you.
Thanks. Mine will be a quick one. I'm Matthew Slabane from Mpumalanga Malahleni. Just to add to Dineo, my sister, not last place to rest and not resting in peace. For they do blasting, they exhume, and they do all sorts of things. The Somkele and many other community issue is so painful. The dispossession does not only take place in the form of grabbing the land, it also takes the soil quality, the water quality in our communities, the biodiversity. It takes away dignity of our people. So as the water sources are being destroyed, the education system is also used as a tool to actually ensure that we are pushed into dependency and eventually the crisis that we have as a result of desperation. So I want to say to you, Dineo and my brother, thanks for this, but there's so much work still to be done. Because if you look at even the TV, the media, it is the one that also perpetuates the dispossession. So we ought to develop programs to challenge even our broadcasting, our media, our education systems in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all those powerful inputs. I'm going to ask the speakers, the three speakers, to just take 30 seconds each to give us one last word. I know I'm eating into your lunch, but let's do this quick and bring the session to a close. Dineo, let's start with you.
Thank you for that, Mbongiseni, and all for the comments and questions. I think you've mentioned quite a lot, but I'll just speak to the Heritage Act. And I think I'm just taking this opportunity to perhaps enlighten some of the community members who have struggled with issues around dispossession. So there is the National Heritage Act, which protects people's ancestral graves, depending on the year as well as where they are allocated. For instance, whether they're in a formal cemetery, as well as whether they're in an informal cemetery. So depending on the two, the age and where they're located, there are ways within which you relocate, and also depending on the age of the grave. So in some instances, you will need an undertaker, the Department of Health, but in many instances, particularly when the graves are 60 years old and 100 years old, you will need an archaeologist. So I just thought I should just deliver that message, just so that you have a bit of awareness about the laws that are protecting graves. And so my critique of the Heritage Act is that it protects the graves as a site, but they do not really or necessarily protect the graves as sites of connections. And I think that's where particularly I bring in my idea of intangible loss, because there's quite a lot is lost, connections are lost when mining companies relocate these. And so that is my issue, and I agree with the first speaker in the Eastern Cape that there is a problem with the Heritage Act, well as heritage management houses. And so as SWAP, we have undertaken to actually have exchange workshops where we are partnering with other institutions to teach around these kinds of regulations so that communities are aware, particularly around the laws. And I think I like the speaker who said, when they speak to mining companies, they say your spirits cannot stop development. And it's actually interesting because when you speak to communities in Lephalale, for instance, they say the opposite. They say part of the reason Medupi would never function effectively, it's because it's built on people's ancestral graves. And so that's where you see spirits actually, in their perspective, stopping development. And that's quite powerful. And I think it's a pity that we don't have enough time to exchange. But my last point really, it's on the issue around dispossession impacting women specifically. And so again, in the work that we do, and we do this with partner organization, we are quite aware, for instance, that issues such as climate change as well as dispossession impact women the most. And so they are actually framed as the shock absorbers of these kinds of issues. So we do have exchange workshops within which we're trying to actually empower communities so that we can build resistance. And I'm sorry that I can't speak to all the comments and questions that have been raised, but thank you so much for these. And I hope that we continue to work together within our different departments and disciplines as well, because I think when we do that, that's how we can actually build resistance. Thank you so much, Mbongiseni.
Thank you, Dineo. Mbuso?
Thank you. Thank you for the comments. I think a lot has been said, so I won't spoil it that much. I'm only going to say, yes, there's a lot that needs to be done, and more so around questions of spirituality, and that's when the communities come in place to assist. And I think we've come up from the comments with suggestion how to deal with issues of the graves. And I see that Dineo is also pointing out the policy and the limitations there. So there's quite a lot that needs to be done. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Muso. Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I really have anything to add, so I just really wanted to say again, thank you, Mbongiseni, thank you, Dineo and Mbuso. It was really honored to have been on this panel with you, and thank you to the organizers.
Thank you indeed to all our speakers, and thank you all of you for joining us. The conversation continues. And what's clear from this panel is that dispossession is not only historical, it's present, it's happening now. Because, as Nonhle Mbutuma said, land is still being seen as profit. There are chiefs involved, there are politicians involved, government is not doing much that it should be doing. And women are bearing the brunt of the dispossession and everything else that goes with it. We'll continue the conversation after lunch. Thank you very much for joining us.